Hello everyone, my name's Kris. I'm back with another video. This is the Congress of Vienna Part 2, 1814 to 1815. Excuse me. This will be a two-parter. That, just like the first one, I made a two-parter. I want to thank my sponsor, not Bud Light Seltzer, Hard Soda, Classic Cola, but Greg Messick, who made this for me in his bathtub. Cheers. God damn, you know how to make them. All right. He didn't, but let's just go along with it. Okay. This was requested. I forgot who. It was requested by a couple people. I apologize. We're going to hurry up because it's 95 out and air conditioner went out. So the window unit can only do so much, but it can't do anything when it's off. So okay, let's start with the video.
This is how the Congress of Vienna was organized. There was an 8-member central committee that would vote on the final treaty. This group included the 5 great powers, plus 3 secondary powers, Spain, Portugal, and Sweden, who each...
So in the first video, for the 5, I said Britain, France, Russia, Spain, Prussia. Got Austria wrong. But Spain... I think I might have said Spain. No, I just said Spain. I didn't say Spain, Portugal. But they were a part of still this thing. So it's not bad. I kind of got them right. I didn't.
Had played an important role in the victory over Napoleon. But the 5 great powers agreed to cut out the Central Committee by negotiating informally among themselves. If the great powers could hammer out a consensus, they could steamroll the Central Committee and the rest of the Congress. In the end, this was where the real power lay. Then there were a number of subcommittees, at least 12, that would go off to the side and debate isolated issues among themselves. When they reached a consensus, they would bring their proposal to the Central Committee for approval. Most of these subcommittees were pretty boring. Which countries had shipping rights in which rivers, stuff like that. But the most important subcommittee was the German Committee. This committee would be chaired by Metternich of Austria, and would have members from every German state in Central Europe, including Prussia. Together, the German states would go away and collectively decide what Central Europe would look like. In a
stupid question. Germany wasn't a country back then, right? It was more Prussia. Apologize, I got a fan on low here. It's a tower fan. They weren't really a country yet. It was Prussia, correct? I mean, they weren't exactly all Prussia, but that's... So, every time I see a German, or, you know, that's what I'm going to. I apologize for the questions. I could look it up, but it defeats the purpose of watching the videos.
Post-Holy Roman Empire world. The negotiations that took place within the German Committee were perhaps the most consequential of the entire Congress.
Hey there, Christopher Walker here, co-founder of Umzu, and I want to talk to you today about our new product. It's called Miracle Morning. Just answer some questions. There are frequently asked questions that people email.
The first roadblock was that the diplomats couldn't agree upon which map to use as a baseline for negotiations. As I've said before, none of these maps accurately reflected what was going on the ground at the time. There were armies from every great power scattered all over Europe. The default map that Britain, Austria, and Russia wanted to use was the 1792 map with some minor modifications. In other words, they wanted the default map to be France as it existed before any of its revolutionary wars of conquest. France and Prussia favored using 1806 as a starting point. This was when Prussia was at its beefiest, so obviously the land-hungry Prussians would push for this date.
Of course they would.
Talleyrand backing Prussia's 1806 proposal was a shrewd move, because not only would it result in an extra beefy France, but more importantly, it allowed Talleyrand to open the Congress by throwing a wedge into the anti-French alliance. There was always the danger of the four great powers ganging up on a defeated France and taking from them whatever they wanted. Hardenberg of Prussia even spoke of partitioning France. But with Talleyrand at the table, that wasn't happening. By pulling Prussia away from the other great powers, Talleyrand was signaling to everybody that France was capable of making trouble, and if the other great powers wanted to reach a consensus, they would actually have to negotiate with France. Metternich and Castlereagh eventually talked Hardenberg down from his 1806 position. It's possible that they made certain informal promises regarding Prussian territorial expansion, but those details are lost to us.
You gotta give to get kind of thing.
So it was decided that they would start with the old 1792 borders. But these brought with them a huge problem: Poland. A beefy Poland had existed in 1792, and if it were to be restored, it would come at the expense of Russia and Prussia. Prussia was land hungry and would not willingly let go of any of its Polish provinces without being compensated somewhere else. Russia didn't want Poland to exist at all, since it would serve as nothing more than a buffer between it and Central Europe. Metternich loved the idea of restoring Poland. Not only would it keep Russia out of Central Europe, but it would push Russia back from the Austrian border. Metternich was even willing to give up Austria's Polish-speaking provinces to make this happen. Castlereagh and Metternich pulled Hardenberg aside and came to a preliminary agreement over Poland. Prussia would give up its Polish-speaking provinces, but Castlereagh and Metternich promised to compensate for this with German-speaking provinces in Central Europe. The three of them came to a handshake agreement that Prussia would receive Saxony, along with several German cities to the west. Under this framework, Prussia's population would increase by 6%, and Poland would remain independent. All three were happy with this. When Tsar Alexander of Russia caught wind of this secret agreement, he threw a pretty public tantrum. He announced that he intended to keep 100% of Poland, including the Polish-speaking provinces currently held by Austria and Prussia. These demands were extreme, and it was difficult to imagine Austria and Prussia simply handing their territory over to Russia for nothing. Talleyrand was also unhappy with the secret Poland agreement and went to see Tsar Alexander privately. Talleyrand specifically wanted to preserve a strong and independent Saxony, since France and Saxony had traditionally been strong allies. Talleyrand made his pitch to the Russian emperor. Alexander replied, "I would rather have war than give up what I occupy." Talleyrand was stunned when he heard this and asked for clarification. "Yes, I would rather have war," Alexander said. Talleyrand began trying to talk the emperor down into a compromise, but before he could make any progress, Alexander stood up and declared, "It's time for the theater, I have to go." He then gave Talleyrand an affectionate hug and ran off. After casually threatening a...
Jesus. It's time for the theater, I thought was some kind of code. And then the hug part, I was like, oh no, he's just going to the theater. Okay, never mind.
a world war, the Russian emperor stayed out partying until 4 in the morning.
Of course he did.
Talleyrand was appropriately alarmed at this behavior and informed the other great powers of Russia's intransigence. Hardenberg began to fear that Prussia may be on the losing end of a conflict over Poland, so he began to move soldiers around to fortify the parts of Poland that they currently occupied. As if that isn't bad enough, Metternich then found out that his monarch was upset with him. The Austrian Emperor Francis summoned Metternich and chastised him for using the Kingdom of Saxony as a bargaining chip. Austria was trying to position itself internationally as the defender of the rule of law and the defender of the rights of smaller Central European states. They couldn't credibly do this if they sold their neighbors up the river at first opportunity. Emperor Francis told Metternich that the Kingdom of Saxony must survive the negotiations, and it must survive at least half of its current size. This made Metternich's task infinitely more complex. Prussia must be convinced to take less of Saxony than they had been promised in their handshake deal. This meant that they would want to hold on to their Polish-speaking provinces. In order to make that work, Metternich would need to strike a deal with Tsar Alexander.
Oh, Jesus.
Metternich went to meet with Alexander, and things got heated. Metternich did not find the Russian emperor particularly intimidating, and spoke to him in the manner that he would speak to any other diplomat. Alexander wasn't really used to that, and after 2 long hours of back and forth, he jumped to his feet, marched over to Metternich, and challenged him to a duel. This kind of thing was above Metternich's pay grade, and required the personal intervention of the Austrian emperor. Francis of Austria soothed Alexander's ego by saying that of course he would win a duel against Metternich, but murdering the Austrian foreign minister might cause an international incident. Recall Metternich's first impression of Alexander, the biggest baby on earth. Was he wrong?
No.
After this incident, Alexander would privately describe Metternich as, quote, a permanent obstacle and, quote, a sworn enemy. The feeling was mutual.
Jeez.
Russia was apparently a dead end, so Metternich went to Prussia next. Metternich explained to Hardenberg that he could now only give Prussia half of Saxony. This was not what they had agreed to, and Hardenberg was understandably upset. The 2 diplomats parted ways with sore feelings and no agreement. The entire deal over Poland seemed to be dead, or at least dying, and the prospect of war with Russia was becoming a growing concern. In desperation, Metternich brought Britain and France into the negotiations. He thought that if 3 great powers could bring a compromise to the other 2, they might be pressured into accepting it.
Unless you're Alexander, who's going to say, why did those 3 agree to something? How come I wasn't a part of it? And then he's going to get mad.
Castlereagh went to see Alexander. He explained to the Russian Tsar that Britain would not accept a Poland under Russian domination. The British public demanded an independent Poland. Alexander finally let his guard down, or at least pretended to, and confessed to Castlereagh that the war with Napoleon had left him in a precarious situation back in Russia. The Russians had sacrificed everything to defeat Napoleon, and the Russian aristocracy felt that they deserved Poland as a reward.
I'll say this, Russia, this war, well, the war with Napoleon, World War I, World War II, Russia loses a lot of people. Like, they have a lot of people, and they throw them in there. And people are willing to fight, and they die, and Russia makes a lot of sacrifices for the cause of winning a war. So I can understand why he's in a bad spot. And I understand that because you sacrifice a lot, maybe more, you kind of feel like, hey, we lost a lot, we deserve a lot. I get that aspect of things. But, they really did. They lost, this war, sure. But like World War I, World War II? World War II, definitely. But,
Alexander doesn't come right out and say this, but he hints that he had promised them exactly that before he left. The implication was that there may be a coup if he went back empty-handed. Castlereagh explained to Alexander that if he took Poland without the consent of the other great powers, it would not end well for him. Prussia and Austria would become permanent enemies of Russia and natural allies to the occupied Polish population. One way or another, Poland would be free.
And they're gonna feed. Hold on. Come on. And they're going to, not feed's a bad word, but they're going to do everything they can to, you know, bring in weapons, all kinds of things, to any, what would you call them, dissidents, or people willing to revolt and start some kind of a guerrilla warfare against them. And I mean, they're going to march right on in here to take everything on. Well, hell, I mean, they can sneak across the border over here to fight the Russians and then pop right back out. You got people in here could cross the border to safety to gather things. I mean, it's just especially with how it's designed here. I mean, you are almost entering into a foreign territory where you're surrounded, you know, three sides really, 1, 2, 3. So it's not a good thing. I sympathize with Alexander a little bit because he's in a bad spot.
It seemed that negotiations were approaching an impasse. And then disaster struck. News got out that the Prussian king had publicly signed off on the Russian annexation of Poland. Tsar Alexander had been personally negotiating with him in secret. Hardenberg was inconsolable. His own king had just stabbed him in the back. It was humiliating. What made matters worse was that the Prussian king was too stupid to realize he wasn't helping. This turn of events lit a fire under the members of the Congress. Castlereagh grabbed Hardenberg and said that if Hardenberg could get the Prussian king to walk back those Poland comments, then Britain would be prepared to back Prussia's demand to annex 100% of Saxony. Hardenberg agreed and marched off to wrestle back control of his monarch. Metternich stayed strategically silent during this exchange. He had secretly written to Castlereagh and promised Austrian support in this scheme, even though it was in direct violation of his emperor's instructions to preserve at least half of Saxony. But that was a problem for another day. And just like that, because of Russian overreach, Britain, France, Prussia, and Austria were all on the same page when it came to Poland. It was 4 against 1. With newfound urgency, the 4 powers came together and drafted 3 possible options to resolve the Poland crisis. Option number 1 called for an enlarged Poland, which would include the Polish-speaking provinces from Russia, Austria, and Prussia. Option number 2 called for a reduced Poland, where Russia, Austria, and Prussia each held on to their Polish-speaking provinces. Option number 3 called for a full partition, where Russia, Austria, and Prussia would come in and divide Poland 3 ways. Under this plan, the people of Poland would have certain political protections across all 3 countries. You might know
Number 3 makes sense, but I feel like you're losing Poland when you do that.
Notice that there was no option in which Russia got to keep all of Poland. That was on purpose.
Oh yeah.
Talleyrand was selected to go and present these options to the Russian Tsar. He explained to Alexander that France's official position was that there should be an independent Poland. He said that if Russia acted on its own and annexed Poland, Prussia and Austria would have no choice but to seriously consider a potential war with Russia. In such a scenario, both would seek to strengthen themselves through territorial expansion. If 3 of the great powers were going around Europe gobbling up territory, France and Britain would have no choice but to intervene. Talleyrand was very clear with Alexander. If he took Poland by force, the great powers would go to war. Alexander was growing frustrated with this constant diplomatic meddling and finally snapped. "I have 200,000 men in the Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland, and I would like to see anyone try to drive me out of it. I have given Prussia Saxony, and Austria consents to it. Alexander had spies everywhere, and apparently he knew that Saxony was secretly being used as a bargaining chip. Talleyrand feigned innocence and asked an innocent question. How could Prussia annex Saxony when they had no claim to the Saxon throne? Alexander responded, "If the king of Saxony will not abdicate, he will be packed off to Russia. He will die there." This was an open threat of violence against another monarch, and it was not the answer that Talleyrand was expecting. After a pause, he responded with caution. The Congress was not assembled to witness a violent assault of this kind. At this, Alexander truly lost his temper. "Do you really think I give much weight to all your parchments and treaties? The King of Prussia will be the King of Prussia and Saxony, just as I will be the Emperor of Russia and the King of Poland." With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving Talleyrand alone with his thoughts.
He must have had a lot of pressure back home.
Lucidchart makes intelligent diagramming easy and helps your best ideas become real.
See, the thing is, in a way, the fear is, that I would think, let's say you give up Poland, fine, just keep it. How do you know it stops there? How do you know it doesn't creep into more I want that over there. You know what I mean? At the same time, is war worth it? You just got out of a 20-year war. And now you're telling all your people, we're going to have peace, we're going to do all this, and now you, oh, well, no, we're going to have war again. Like, this is just a crap situation.
When Metternich learned of Alexander's outburst, he finally lost his patience. He decided to meet once more with the Russian Tsar, this time with a different negotiating tactic. He told Alexander that Austria was considering unilaterally selecting a Polish king to rule over an independent Poland. This was an unspoken threat. Metternich was telling Alexander that all he had to do was snap his fingers, and Poland would rise up against Russian occupation. Alexander responded by issuing an unspoken threat of his own. He invited Metternich to come to Poland and inspect the Russian soldiers stationed there, all 200,000 of them. Metternich then dropped the subtlety. He flatly told Alexander that if he took Poland, the entire Congress of Vienna would be against him. After this, tempers flared, voices were raised, and things got personal. From this moment on, Metternich would refuse to be in the same room with the Russian Tsar unless others were present, which...
Who doesn't want to be a fly on the wall when all this is happening? Who doesn't want to be there and just witness all of this? Just the back and forth.
Frankly, is exactly the kind of grudge that I respect.
I'm sorry, I'm going to go back just a second.
And then a very troubling thing happened.
Accidentally
Without
cut him off, and I didn't want to do that.
To be in the same room with the Russian Tsar unless others were present, which frankly is exactly the kind of grudge that I respect.
Okay.
And then a very troubling thing happened. Without notice, the Russian soldiers in Saxony began to pull back and leave. Shortly after this, the Prussian soldiers occupying parts of Poland did the same. All of a sudden, there was a lot of military movement, and nobody knew why. Within a matter of weeks, a lot more Prussian soldiers entered Saxony, and a lot more Russian soldiers entered Poland. It became clear that there was some kind of handoff happening, a secret agreement between Russia and Prussia. Both were openly fortifying their positions and preparing for war. Bad, bad, bad. Castlereagh wrote a summary of these events to Prime Minister Liverpool back in Britain. Quote, "Unless the Emperor of Russia can be brought to a more moderate and sound course of public conduct, the peace, which we have so dearly purchased, will be but of a short duration. You must make up your mind to watch him and resist him if necessary, as another Bonaparte." Back in Britain, the domestic political situation was approaching a boiling point. The narrow, conservative Whig majority in the House of Commons was in jeopardy. the liberal Whig opposition had weaponized the Saxony and Poland crisis, and were using it as a rallying cry against authoritarianism everywhere. The liberals had the public on their side, and now they were calling for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland, with no concessions to the other powers whatsoever. Liverpool was in a precarious situation, and could not appear to be throwing the people of Poland to the Russian wolves, or bears or whatever. The liberals wanted to paint Liverpool as sympathetic to the Russian tyrant, and so Liverpool needed to prove them wrong. He wrote to Castlereagh, instructing him to back away from any deal that would partition Saxony or Poland. The official British position would now call for full independence for both countries. You would think that such an abrupt shift in priorities would blow up the negotiations, but it really didn't. After being stabbed in the back by Russia and Prussia, Metternich felt no obligation to bend over backwards for them anymore. The Austrian emperor had always wanted an independent Saxony, and Metternich had always wanted an independent Poland, so he joined the British in calling for both. Talleyrand had always favored full independence for both countries, and quickly followed Metternich's lead. This audacious show of force from Russia and Prussia spooked every small and medium-sized state in Central Europe. If Saxony could get steamrolled like this, nobody was safe. Virtually every Central European state found their courage and backed Castlereagh and Metternich's call for an independent Saxony and an independent Poland. Austria had long sought to position itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law, and now...
I would just like to say, all these independent countries here, power, power, power. That's your buffer. And then that's you know, Russia. So they're surrounded by power. It's a pretty easy decision. Because you got this buffer here. They're going to come up and fight here. They can come over here and land. And then they can march through. So, I mean, yeah, that was the right decision to make. It's an easy decision. When you're surrounded by power, you go with the power. Because you're not going to have to take that much of a beating. You know, they're going to be doing the heavy lifting. Sorry.
Now, that strategy was paying off.
My opinion.
Metternich suddenly found himself at the center of attention, the most popular guy in Vienna, the hub to which every Central European state wanted to attach itself. When the dust settled, it became clear that Russia and Prussia's power grab had been a massive blunder. Tsar Alexander must have realized that he had backed himself into a corner, because he began sending signals to Austria that he might be satisfied with less than 100% of Poland. This was exactly the sort of opening that everyone was waiting for. Attention then turned to Prussia. There were reports that Prussia was building fortifications inside of occupied Saxony, which drew broad international condemnation. It soon became conspicuous that Tsar Alexander was remaining silent. Prussia was being left hanging out to dry. A desperate Hardenberg visited Talleyrand and tried to get him to break away from the other powers by making wild promises. At one point, Hardenberg offered France the Netherlands, which of course was a red line for Britain, and not something that Hardenberg was in a position to give away. Talleyrand wisely turned him down. Hardenberg was out of options. He backed down from his maximalist position and began telling people that he would accept no less than half of Saxony. Metternich jumped at this. An independent Saxony at half of its current size would satisfy both the Austrian Emperor and all of those smaller Central European states. After some back and forth over specifics, an agreement was reached. Prussia would receive half of Saxony, along with some German-speaking territory along the Rhine. A reduced Saxony would remain fully independent, and war would be averted.
While searching for a new home, a group of travelers found a place that was rich in resources.
But then there was still the issue with Poland. Alexander reopened negotiations by offering to let Austria and Prussia keep their Polish-speaking provinces, a real change of tune from last time. Castlereagh then called for the creation of a strong Polish constitution built upon liberal democratic values. Tsar Alexander immediately agreed and publicly thanked Castlereagh for his advocacy on behalf of the people of Poland.
What?
If you find Alexander's change in demeanor a little shocking, you aren't alone. It's clear that there were some back-channel talks going on during the Saxony crisis, and it seems that concessions were made in order to get Alexander to back off and throw Prussia under the bus. What was happening now over Poland seemed well choreographed, as if it had all been drawn up in some back room somewhere. The great powers quickly reached an agreement over Poland, and it looked like this. Austria and Prussia would be allowed to keep their Polish-speaking provinces. The rest would become the Kingdom of Poland. The new kingdom would have a strong liberal democratic constitution, with an independent legislature, independent courts, and an independent army. The King of Poland would be a quasi-ceremonial role, tightly constrained by the Polish constitution. Under this deal, it was decided that Tsar Alexander of Russia would separately and simultaneously become the King of Poland. On paper, this satisfied the British and Austrian demands for an independent Poland, since the new kingdom retained the right to make its own laws and field its own military. It also satisfied Alexander's demand to take Poland as a prize for defeating Napoleon. But obviously, Poland could not be truly independent under this arrangement.
No.
With the Russian emperor as their king, it became impossible for Poland to resist creeping Russian influence. For the rest of Alexander's reign, he would chip away at Poland's independent political institutions and slowly work towards swallowing Poland into the Russian Empire. By the time his successor came to the throne, the new Russian emperor declared that he no longer felt bound by the Polish constitution, and then that was that.
Jeez.
It's undeniable that Castlereagh and Metternich sacrificed Poland for an independent Saxony. Perhaps they saw the writing on the wall. The truth was that if Russia took Poland by force, Austria and Britain really weren't in a position to take it back. Perhaps they decided that if they couldn't stop Russia from taking Poland, they could turn the whole thing into a poison pill. As an island of liberalism within the Russian Empire, Poland would confound and distract Tsar Alexander for the rest of his reign. The Poland and Saxony crisis brought the great powers back to the brink of war. But now that there was a deal in place, messy as it was, there was finally room to breathe. One of the conditions attached to the Poland deal was that Tsar Alexander, having received his great prize, was to get out of the way and let everybody else negotiate what they came to negotiate. There were still several outstanding questions that needed to be settled, but none more pressing than the fate of the German-speaking states in Central Europe.
Perfect time. I'm going to go ahead and end it here. Yeah, this is really good. I like this. I'm going to end it here, and I'm going to start the second part of this video just as soon as I'm done here. Until then, have a good day, have a good night.